Okay, so we have the context created. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say what ports do we want to assign to it. Here, or we call this allocating the interfaces. So under global config, we're going to go to the VDC, and then we're going to choose what particular port numbers that we're going to assign. Now, when we do this, the numbers that you can assign are going to be based on the individual line card, and the line card has what we call the port groupings or the port groups. What the port group defines is which ASIC is in charge of managing the individual ports. And how many ASICs that the card has is going to control how many interfaces that you need to assign to an individual context. Now, you don't necessarily need to memorize this information, but you do want to be aware of when you're going to do the physical implementation that this is a potential limitation of the box. So for example, if we look at the show VDC, and let's say that we want to go to VDC 7K9. Okay, to get there, we're going to say switch to VDC, and then the name, N7K9. Okay, and you can tab through these. We'll say 9. And from here, let's look at the show module. So we see we have two modules. We have the supervisor, SUP2E, and then we have the line card F348XP. Okay, the line card in the data planes is plugged in physically to module number 1. So from here, if we look at the show interface, okay, so let's say show interface status. Okay, I want to know what ports are assigned. So I have ports 33 through 40 on line card number 1. And let's look at the show interface E133 capabilities. Okay, this is going to show us the physical functions of the port. Like what speed does it support? Is it a 10 gig port, 1 gig port, 40 gig port? What are the queuing parameters? What are the ingress queues? What are the egress queues? What are the different software and hardware features it supports? And then also, within the scope of this discussion, is going to be what is the port group members? Okay, so what other interfaces belong to this particular grouping? And in this case, for the F348 card, the grouping is going to be consecutive ports of 8. So it's a 48 port card, and there's 8 ports per group. So it means that you can assign this to 6 different contexts potentially. Okay, it's not to say that you could not take the entire card and assign the entire card to the context, but it means that you cannot assign it to 7 different contexts because of the way that the ASICs are physically designed on the card. Okay, the way that you can also see this is if we go back to admin. So let's exit out here of the user context, and we're going to look at the show VDC membership. Show VDC membership is going to show how the ports are allocated. So right now it says interfaces E11 through E18. These are unallocated, or these are not assigned to any context. They're in context number 0, which is just a default placeholder. Okay, the other context 3, 5, 7, etc., they have their ports assigned in groupings of 8. So 9 through 16, 17 through 24, etc. What this means is that when I go to global config, so if I say config T and VDC, I give it the name N7K1, and I go to allocate an interface, and if I were to say like E1/5, it says if you apply Ethernet 1/5 to this context, what I'm really going to do is to allocate ports 1 through 8 because they're all inside that same port grouping. So you don't need to memorize what card has what grouping. It's going to tell you when you go to do the allocation. If the ports are missing, it says, hey, if you grab number 5, you have to grab 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And what's important about this within a real design is that it says if you do this change, that if the port is in another context, you're going to remove it from the context and you're going to delete the config. Okay, it's going to cause all the config associated with them to be removed. So if this box was forwarding traffic right now in production and you were to take port number 12 and move it from context number 3 to context number 2, it means that it's really moving ports 9 through 16 and then deleting whatever software config you have on those interfaces. So you do have to be kind of careful here when you're doing the allocation. It does give you a warning, but it's not going to say, hey, you're removing it from 7K3 context. It just says, be aware that this is going to happen if you say yes. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to say, yes, I do want to do the allocation. It says, error, one or more interfaces are from a module type that is not supported by this VDC. Okay, what this means, if we look back at the show VDC, it says that for context number one, if we zoom out a little bit here, it says context number one, the type of ports or the type of line cards that are allowed are M1, M1XL, M2XL, and F2E. But notice what's not listed here is F3 card, which is the type of module that we have. And the reason why is that these two are not compatible with each other. You cannot have a context that has an M1 card and an F3 card at the same time. There's some sort of hardware incompatibility between the two of them. So not only do you have to choose what ports that you're allocating, you have to say what type of cards do I want to allow to go into this particular context. And we can see this if we just look at the show run. So if we show run, or if we look at the show run VDC, it says that for a context in 7K1, we have the amount of resources limited so that you can only use these particular types of modules. So what I need to do is to remove this config, and I need to replace it so it says F3 is the type of module that I want to use. Okay, so we're going to go under global config, we're going to go to VDC N7K1, and then say we want to limit the resources for the module type, and we want to allow F3 modules. Okay, it says this is going to cause the ports of unallowed types to be removed. You want to do this? Yes. Okay, so in other words, if I did have an M1 card assigned to that VDC, it's deleting it from the config. Now, it would still stay in the startup config, so if you accidentally delete it, you can re-add it later, and then the config is going to be re-added to it. But point being is that if it's actively forwarding data at that particular point, it's basically like the same as unplugging the module physically from the chassis. Okay, once we do this, so once we assign the port type, let's look at the show CLI history. Okay, so what commands did we type previously? And we're going to say show me just the command, so show me unformatted. And I'm going to pipe to show the last number of commands. Let's say show me the last 10 commands that I typed. Okay, so I'm going to go under config T. I'm going to go to VDC N7K1, and I'm going to allocate interface E1/5. So do I want to take those other ports? Yes. Okay, notice here this is the default answer. So if you were pasting this config in and you accidentally send another carriage return and this is the wrong port number, it would delete it from the other context and then move it to the new one. So be very careful in a real design with this when you apply it. You have to make sure that you're matching the right port numbers. Okay, result of this now is that if we look at the show VDC membership, we should see now that for that context ID number 2, which name is N7K1, we have interfaces E11 through E1/8. Okay, if we now say we want to switch to the VDC, okay, VDC is going to be N7K1. Says we need to go through the system dialog. So do we want to enforce password security, or basically this is like the password rules? Do you need uppercase, lowercase, numbers, non-alpha characters, etc.? Okay, I'm going to say no here. So type the password and confirm it. Do I want to enter the basic config dialog? No. Okay, let's say show interface status. Okay, now I have interfaces E11 through 8. If we look at the show run, we can see other than the ports and the default user, okay, user was admin that it was creating there. Config is pretty much blank. Okay, we have vThen1 created. We have the management VRF. Okay, this is going to be if you want to remotely manage the box. But we can see from this individual context view, it doesn't know that it's part of the overall chassis. So if I was SSHing or telnetting directly into this context, I would not be able to access the admin interface of the overall physical chassis. Okay, so again, in terms of allocating the interfaces, we need to make sure that we're doing the allocation based on the ASIC boundaries. and the parser is automatically going to check that for us. So what I said was to allocate port E1/5, and it knew based on F348 XP card that there's 8 groups of consecutive ports. So it means it was really port E11 through E18, not just E15 on its own. Okay, additionally, the unallocated ports, we saw that those were allocated by default into VDC 0. It's basically just a placeholder. So if you show VDC membership and you see a bunch of interfaces listed as VDC 0, it might mean that there's a misconfig of the admin context, that the type of card is not properly allowed.